The dining room was brighter than usual, but the warmth of the lights did nothing to ease the chill I felt the moment I stepped inside. My parents sat rigidly at the head of the table, their posture almost statuesque, a quiet authority that had always been more oppressive than protective. Their eyes swept over me, sharp and critical, and I felt that familiar shrinking in my chest, the way I always did when I faced their silent judgment. Even after all these years, despite my efforts to meet their expectations, the weight of their scrutiny never eased. My siblings were already seated, chatting and laughing about things I didn't understand. Plates clinked and glasses rattled as they passed dishes to each other effortlessly, their camaraderie a subtle reminder that I was always on the outside of their little world. I took a deep breath, forcing my shoulders to stay upright, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I forced a smile that I knew didn't reach my eyes. As expected, my father leaned back in his chair with the deliberate slowness of someone about to deliver a verdict. He cleared his throat, and I could feel the room tense as everyone waited. "You don't deserve any help," he said, his voice flat, unyielding, the kind that makes words feel like a cold blow to the chest. "Be independent." My mother didn't even blink. She simply nodded, as though the words were an undeniable truth carved into stone. A part of me wanted to erupt, to let the fury I had carried inside for years finally spill out. I wanted to tell him about the countless nights I stayed awake working, the sacrifices I had made quietly, the times I had stepped back so others could shine, all in the hope that someday I might earn even the smallest recognition. But I didn't. I swallowed it, like I had swallowed so many insults before. The rest of the dinner continued around me like a storm that I had no power to stop. Their conversations twisted around me, sometimes like a knife hidden in casual words. "I think it's so hard managing alone at that age," my mother remarked casually, a pointed glance at me hidden beneath her polite smile. My siblings laughed at a joke, not noticing, or not caring, about the weight of her words. Every sentence, every pause, felt like a test, a deliberate probe to see if I would break, if I would crumble under the scrutiny they had perfected over decades. I felt my hands tighten into fists under the table. My jaw was rigid, and yet, somewhere deep inside, something had shifted. I realized as I sat there quietly that this moment was mine, not theirs. I would not cry. I would not beg. I would not plead for their approval because I had learned, long ago, that their praise was never freely given, that it was a currency they hoarded with selfish precision. Tonight, I decided, would be different. I would show them a strength that couldn't be taken away, a quiet independence that spoke louder than words. I allowed myself a small, careful smile as I reached for my water glass, and I could feel my father noticing it, his eyes narrowing in curiosity, perhaps sensing that something inside me had shifted. The seed of change had been planted, and I knew it would grow, quietly but relentlessly. After dinner, I excused myself, walking past the lingering conversation, past the quiet jabs and barely concealed smirks. I felt calm on the outside, though inside my mind raced with plans I had kept hidden from them for years. Every slight, every dismissive glance, every insult had fueled a fire that had been waiting for the right moment. That moment, I realized, was now. In the days that followed, I began quietly preparing for my independence. I reviewed my finances, made careful budgets, and ensured that every small piece of my life that could give me freedom was firmly under my control. I applied to opportunities one had previously been too cautious to consider, projects that challenged my abilities and demanded every ounce of skill I could summon. I worked silently, never announcing my progress, never seeking approval, always planning for the day when my life would no longer be dictated by their judgments. It was slow, deliberate, and entirely mine. Every choice, every step, strengthened a confidence I had rarely allowed myself to feel. Their words, once sharp and suffocating, began to lose their power. I was no longer a girl waiting for recognition. I was becoming a woman taking her life into her own hands. And I smiled quietly to myself, knowing that the day they would realize it was coming closer with every calculated step I took. The morning after that tense dinner, I woke with a strange mix of anger and clarity. The words my father had spat out, so final, so cold, lingered in my mind, but instead of crushing me, they ignited a resolve I hadn't felt before. I poured myself a cup of coffee, feeling its warmth seep into my hands, and I let myself think clearly, calmly, deliberately. I would not allow their judgment to dictate the terms of my life anymore. If they saw me as weak, dependent, unworthy of help, that was their perspective. It had never been my reality, and it never would be again. I sat at my small desk, organizing my bills and accounts, making notes in neat columns. Every dollar, every savings plan, every investment I had quietly started over the past few months suddenly felt like ammunition. My parents had believed that control over my finances gave them power over me, but I was already steps ahead. I checked my savings, calculated the months it would take to rent a modest apartment, and made a mental list of everything I would need to make it possible. The next step, I knew, was to build leverage. For years, I had allowed opportunities to pass because I doubted myself, feared failure, or anticipated disapproval. Not anymore. I started applying for projects and positions that stretched my abilities, some of them bold leaps beyond what I had dared to imagine. I made quiet calls to mentors and colleagues I had admired from afar, connecting with them in a professional, confident manner. No one needed to know I was building this web of independence under the radar. In fact, secrecy made it even sweeter. No one could undermine it, not even my parents. At home, life went on as usual. My parents continued their subtle jabs, the thinly veiled criticisms aimed to provoke, to remind me of my place. "Do you really think you can manage that on your own?" My father would ask casually, watching my reaction. My siblings, oblivious, laughed at jokes or boasted about their plans. And yet, every time they tried to provoke me, I felt an almost mischievous calm. Their words no longer had the power they once held. I smiled politely, nodded, and continued with my day. Inside, I was building quietly, deliberately. Every insult became fuel, every sneer a stepping stone. I rented a small office space in my mind before even signing a lease, a vision of independence where I could thrive without constant scrutiny. I sketched out the layout of the apartment I hoped to secure, visualizing furniture, light, and even the corner where I would place my small desk. This act, though silent, was an assertion of control. I imagined my life without their constant interference, without their judgmental eyes tracking every move. The thought made my chest swell with a quiet pride I had never dared to feel openly before. Days turned into weeks. I began waking early, working late, dedicating myself to skill building and self-advancement. I networked discreetly, seeking opportunities to showcase my abilities in a way that required no validation from anyone at home. Every small success, every tiny step forward, became a secret victory, a reminder that my life was no longer theirs to manipulate. I paid attention to every detail, from budgeting carefully to ensuring that I had emergency funds ready. I was building an invisible fortress around myself, and nothing could penetrate it. The more I built, the more confident I became. I started walking with a steadier gait, speaking with a firmer tone, even in casual conversations. The subtle shift in my demeanor did not go unnoticed by my family, though they could not articulate it. My father would squint at me during meals, my mother's questions would carry a faint edge of curiosity, and my siblings would occasionally glance my way, sensing, perhaps, a change they couldn't define. I let them think what they would. Their awareness didn't matter. I knew that the life I was quietly creating would speak for itself. By the end of the third week, I had secured a modest apartment in a part of town that was convenient yet completely separate from my family's gaze. It wasn't extravagant, but it was mine. I visited it quietly, imagining it furnished with care, every corner reflecting the life I wanted to lead. It was a sanctuary from judgment, a space where my independence could flourish unchallenged. The act of taking this step, of asserting my ability to manage my own life without anyone's approval, filled me with a quiet, unshakable joy. And so, the quiet plan that had begun with a single painful sentence at the dinner table had begun to bear fruit. The words, "You don't deserve any help," no longer haunted me. Instead, they had become a catalyst, a spark that had lit the path to a life built entirely on my own terms. I had decided, once and for all, that their control ended at the door of my determination. From that point on, every move I made was intentional, every choice deliberate. I was no longer reacting to my parents' expectations. I was creating a reality that they could not dictate. It was a freedom I had never known, and with each passing day, The invisible chains that had bound me to their judgment grew weaker and weaker. For the first time in years, I felt the intoxicating thrill of true independence, a strength that no words could undermine and no jabs could diminish. Weeks passed, and with each day, I noticed subtle shifts in the way I carried myself. The tension that had once anchored me to my parents' judgments was lifting, replaced by a quiet, unshakable confidence. I walked through my days with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt before, each task completed meticulously, each decision weighed and measured carefully. This was no longer about proving them wrong. It was about finally proving to myself that I could thrive on my own. The apartment I had rented became more than just a living space. It was a symbol of everything I had silently built. I furnished it thoughtfully, selecting pieces that reflected calm, order, and personal taste. Each corner was a testament to my independence, a place where no one's expectations or criticisms could reach me. Even the small touches, a carefully chosen lamp, a bookshelf I had finally organized to my liking, felt like quiet acts of rebellion. They had tried to diminish me, but here I was, creating a world that belonged solely to me. At home, the dynamic had begun to shift without anyone realizing it. My parents continued their jabs, their thinly veiled criticisms meant to provoke me, but I had grown impervious. I smiled politely when my father asked if I was sure I could manage all on my own, and nodded gracefully when my mother commented on the challenges of living independently at such a young age. Their words, once suffocating, now bounced off me like water on stone. I could feel the power slipping from their grasp, the authority they once wielded so effortlessly fading as I quietly built my life on a foundation they could not touch. I began taking on projects at work that required initiative and leadership, opportunities one would have shied away from before. I networked with colleagues and mentors, creating professional relationships that opened doors I had never dared knock on before. Each success, each step forward, reinforced the knowledge that my life was mine to shape. And all the while, I carried myself with calm assurance, never boasting, never announcing, only allowing my results to speak louder than any words. Financial independence became another pillar of my transformation. I meticulously managed my accounts, ensuring that every penny earned and every dollar saved was under my control. I no longer felt the looming fear that I might falter without my parents' guidance because I had created systems to support myself. The safety and stability that came with this quiet discipline were empowering. Every morning I woke with a sense of security I had never known before, knowing that my life was increasingly my own. Even my relationships began to evolve. I noticed how people responded differently when I carried myself with this newfound confidence. Friends and colleagues treated me with more respect, subtly shifting the dynamics I had grown accustomed to. My voice was heard in conversations without effort, my opinions considered seriously, and my presence acknowledged naturally. It was intoxicating, this feeling of being seen not as someone seeking validation but as someone fully capable, fully self-sufficient. At the same time, I made a conscious choice to maintain my calm exterior around my family. I did not want confrontation or drama. I wanted them to witness the transformation quietly, to understand through observation, not through argument. This restraint was, in itself, a form of power. Every polite smile, every courteous nod, every calm response to their provocations was a reminder that I no longer belonged to their narrative. I was writing my own. One evening, after weeks of a silent evolution, I sat in my apartment, reviewing my achievements. The sense of pride and empowerment I felt was overwhelming. I realized that their words had lost all control over me. The girl they had tried to belittle at the dinner table had grown into a woman who carried herself with assurance, whose independence was complete, and whose silence had become her strength. I also understood that independence wasn't only about financial stability or physical space, it was about emotional freedom. No longer did I crave their approval or fear their disapproval. Their attempts to provoke or belittle were now just background noise, irrelevant to the life I was building. Every day, I reaffirmed to myself that I was capable, deserving, and strong. And with that realization, a plan began to take shape in my mind. The second dinner, the inevitable encounter with my family, would come. But this time, I would be prepared, fully equipped with the life I had created. Their words, their judgments, their attempts to control me would meet not anger or tears, but quiet, undeniable proof that I no longer required their validation. I would show them that independence was not just a word, it was a reality I had manifested with patience, strategy, and unwavering determination. By the time that dinner arrived, I was a different person entirely. Gone was the tense, anxious girl who had shrunk in her parents' gaze. In her place stood a calm, confident woman whose silence carried more power than any argument. I had mastered the art of quiet strength, the ability to build, to grow, and to assert control without resorting to confrontation or vengeance. And in that calm certainty, I knew that the transformation was complete. I was independent in every sense that mattered, untouchable by their criticisms, unshaken by their attempts to provoke. The seeds planted at the first dinner had fully grown into a life that reflected my resilience, my intelligence, and my unyielding determination to claim the freedom and respect I deserved. The evening of the second dinner arrived with the same polite formality that had always marked our family gatherings, but I was not the same person who had nervously stepped into the room weeks ago. I had learned, grown, and quietly fortified every part of my life. Tonight, I carried myself differently, poised, confident, untouchable. I could feel the difference in my step, the subtle lift in my chin, the steady rhythm of my heartbeat that no longer skipped in fear at the sight of my parents. The dining room looked familiar, unchanged, yet everything about it felt different. My parents were seated, straight-backed, eyes flicking toward the door as if to gauge my arrival. My siblings chattered as usual, passing dishes, exchanging jokes, trying to include me, but the dynamic had already shifted before I even spoke a word. The energy I carried with me, the calm, confident presence, was immediately noticeable. My father's eyes narrowed slightly, scanning me with an intensity that had once made me shrink inside. He had expected hesitation, perhaps fear, maybe even a plea for help. What he found instead was a quiet self-assuredness that he had never seen before. My mother's polite smile carried an edge of curiosity, a subtle acknowledgement that something was different. My siblings glanced at me and paused mid-laugh, sensing, though not fully understanding, that a change had occurred. The meal began with casual conversation, but I could sense the underlying tension. My father, always the first to jab, asked with a slight smirk, "Still managing everything on your own?" His tone was carefully neutral, but the intention behind the words was unmistakable, a test, a probe to see if I had faltered. I looked at him calmly, keeping my voice soft but steady. "Yes, I've managed quite well, thank you." The simplicity of my reply seemed to unsettle him more than any outburst could have. My mother added, "It must be difficult living completely independently at your age," with a feigned concern that rang hollow. I nodded politely, smiling faintly, as if acknowledging her words but letting them float harmlessly past me. As the dinner progressed, subtle comparisons and reminders of family expectations began to surface, just as they always had. My father remarked on how carefully I had to plan finances, my mother on the challenges of managing household responsibilities, and my siblings made offhand comments about how they had always relied on the guidance of their parents. Yet, each word, instead of breaking me, reinforced my confidence. I responded only with calm acknowledgement, never defensive, never emotional, allowing my presence and demeanor to silently speak volumes. Midway through the meal, I noticed the first crack in their composed facades. My father's hand paused midair as he reached for a dish, his eyes flicking to mine with an unreadable expression. My mother's eyebrows knitted subtly, her lips pressed together as she processed something she couldn't quite articulate. Even my siblings' laughter faltered slightly, replaced by a quiet curiosity. I realized, with a quiet thrill, that the transformation I had nurtured in solitude was now visible to everyone at the table. When the main course was nearly finished, I casually mentioned a small personal achievement, a project I had recently completed that had earned recognition at work. I spoke of it matter-of-factly, without boastfulness, letting the accomplishment stand on its own. The reaction was immediate. My father's jaw tightened, his posture stiffened, and my mother's polite smile faltered. My siblings exchanged quick glances, their surprise evident despite their attempts to mask it. The subtle shock in the room was palpable, a delicate shift in the balance that had always favored my parents' control. I had not shouted, argued, or demanded recognition. I had merely lived quietly, strategically, and effectively. The life I had built in private was now undeniable in its presence. For the first time, they could not manipulate or belittle me with words alone. My silence had become my power. As the meal drew to a close, I continued to share small but significant updates about my life. The independence of my new apartment, the confidence in managing my finances, and the self-sufficiency I had nurtured in the weeks since that first dinner. Each revelation, delivered with calm composure, chipped away at the authority they had so long exercised. My parents' expressions alternated between disbelief and a flicker of unease. My siblings, usually so confident in their positions at the table, now seemed uncertain, unsure how to react. By the end of the evening, the shift was undeniable. The room that had once been a stage for judgment and humiliation was now a testament to my quiet strength. I left the table with my head held high, smiling faintly, feeling the weight of every insult, every dismissive glance, and every critical word finally dissolve into irrelevance. The life I had built, the patience I had practiced, and the independence I had claimed had spoken louder than any argument or confrontation could have. For the first time, I understood the true meaning of strength, not in shouting or retaliation, but in deliberate action, consistency, and self-assuredness. I had allowed them to underestimate me, to believe they still held power, and in doing so, I had built something they could neither deny nor control. By the time dessert was served, I knew the moment had arrived. The careful build-up of weeks, the silent planning, the endless preparation, all of it was about to reveal itself. I set my fork down and let the room take notice of the change in me, calm, poised, self-assured. My parents had been attempting to maintain their usual control, but it was slipping through their fingers, and they knew it even if they couldn't name it. I wanted to share something with all of you, I began, my voice soft but steady. I've recently moved into my own apartment. It's modest, but it's completely mine. I manage all my finances independently, and I've also taken on a new project at work that has challenged me in ways I never thought possible, and I succeeded. For a moment, the room froze. My father's fork covered midair, his eyes widening in disbelief. My mother's polite smile faltered, her expression betraying a mix of surprise and apprehension. Even my siblings, who had spent years quietly assuming I was struggling, blinked in stunned silence. The laughter and casual conversation that had filled previous dinners evaporated, replaced by an almost tangible tension. I allowed myself a small, serene smile, sensing the power shift without needing to say another word. I wanted to let you know, I continued calmly, that I am fully capable of managing my life on my own. I don't need anyone to guide me or validate my choices. I've taken responsibility for everything, and it's been incredibly rewarding. Their reactions were immediate and telling. My father leaned back, mouth slightly open, clearly caught off guard. My mother's fingers tightened around her napkin, and my siblings exchanged quick, astonished glances, unsure how to respond. None of them had anticipated that I could achieve this level of independence, nor had they expected me to present it with such composure. I watched quietly as the realization sank in. The woman at the table was not the same person they had dismissed weeks ago. I did not need to argue, to shout, or to demand acknowledgement. The proof was there in the life I had quietly constructed. Every word they had used to diminish me now felt powerless, their attempts to control irrelevant. The room itself seemed to shift, bending to the quiet strength I had cultivated. My father finally managed a low, almost hesitant, I didn't realize you had done all this. His words carried a rare vulnerability, a crack in the facade of authority he had long held. My mother's smile returned, but it was thin and uncertain, no longer the commanding presence it had once been. My siblings remained silent, processing the revelation, their confidence from past dinners replaced by quiet astonishment. The rest of the dinner passed in a subdued atmosphere. I spoke of small victories, of the life I had built with patience and diligence, each sentence measured, each fact calmly stated. There was no gloating, only clarity and quiet pride. Every revelation was a testament to the independence they had claimed I could never achieve, every achievement a silent rebuke to the dismissive words they had once wielded as weapons. By the time we finished the meal, the transformation in the room was undeniable. My parents' usual dominance had been replaced by a cautious, unsettled respect, their jabs rendered powerless against the evidence of my self-sufficiency. My siblings, usually so quick to include themselves in the family hierarchy, now looked at me with a mix of admiration and disbelief. The girl who had once sat silently, shrinking under their judgment, now held the quiet center of the room with effortless confidence. As I rose to leave, I felt the culmination of weeks of careful preparation, patience, and persistence. I smiled politely, acknowledging the table without arrogance, and walked toward the door with my head held high. Each step echoed the quiet triumph of someone who had finally claimed her life on her own terms. The power of silence had worked in my favor. I had never needed to raise my voice or make a scene. The strength I had nurtured quietly, day by day, had spoken for itself, leaving a lasting impression far more potent than any argument could have. Independence was no longer just a concept, it was a tangible, undeniable reality. As the door closed behind me, I felt a surge of satisfaction unlike anything I had ever known. The validation I had sought for years from my parents was irrelevant now. I had built a life that required no permission, no approval, no recognition. I had claimed my strength silently, deliberately, and fully. And in that quiet victory, I understood the truth I had been chasing all along. True strength isn't loud, it isn't demanding, it is steadfast, patient, and unwavering. I had become untouchable not by confrontation, but by the deliberate act of taking control of my life, step by step, without yielding to fear or doubt. The dinner table, once a place of humiliation, had now become a stage for the power I had always possessed, quietly and unapologetically. After that night, everything subtly changed. I returned to my apartment, closing the door behind me with a sense of finality I had never experienced before. The life I had quietly built now existed in full view of the world, and yet it was mine alone. My parents could no longer wield their words as weapons. Their jabs, their criticisms, even their silent disapproval were rendered powerless because I no longer allowed them to define my worth. I spent the next days settling into my new rhythm. Each morning, I woke with clarity and purpose, fully aware that my independence was no longer conditional. I cooked my meals, organized my finances, managed my schedule, and pursued my ambitions with confidence. Every task, no matter how small, was a reminder that I had finally taken control of my life, that no one could diminish me again. I reflected often on that first dinner, the tense room, the judgmental stares, the cold words. For years, I had internalized their criticisms, letting them dictate my sense of self. Now, I could see those moments for what they were. Challenges meant to shape my resilience, opportunities to prove that my strength could not be dictated by anyone else. Every insult, every sneer, every comparison had been fuel for the quiet fire that now burned within me. At home, the dynamics shifted permanently. My parents still spoke, still tried to offer advice, but there was an unmistakable hesitation in their tone, a subtle respect that hadn't existed before. They realized, perhaps reluctantly, that I could stand fully on my own. Their authority, once absolute, no longer had sway over my choices or emotions. My siblings, too, began treating me differently, not with overt confrontation, but with a recognition that I was no longer the person they had assumed I was. The apartment became a sanctuary, not just in a physical sense, but emotionally. It was a place where I could breathe, create, and grow without fear of judgment. Each corner reflected the careful decisions I had made, the independence I had nurtured. The simple act of locking my door at night became a symbol of a freedom I had fought silently to claim. In that quiet, I felt safe, untouchable, and entirely in control of my own narrative. With time, I realized that true strength is not about confrontation. It is about patience, strategy, and the deliberate act of building a life that cannot be shaken by the opinions of others. The independence I had cultivated was not a rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was a reclamation of self-respect, of dignity, of the right to exist fully on my own terms. Every quiet victory had reinforced this truth, each step forward a testament to the power of perseverance. I began sharing small, personal milestones with friends and colleagues, not to boast, but to affirm the reality of my independence. Promotions, achievements, Even simple successes became markers of a life I had built deliberately without seeking validation. The satisfaction of accomplishing these things quietly, without drama or confrontation, was immeasurable. The quiet strength I had cultivated became a source of pride that no one could take away. One evening, as I prepared a simple dinner for myself in my apartment, I realized how far I had come. The fear and self-doubt that had once accompanied me to family gatherings had been replaced by confidence and peace. I could recall the cold words of my parents with clarity, but they no longer held power over me. My silence, patience, and deliberate action had transformed the tables entirely. I had become the master of my own life, and that knowledge was exhilarating. Reflecting on the journey, I understood a profound truth. Independence is not simply about financial stability or physical separation. It is about self-respect, emotional resilience, and the courage to build a life guided solely by one's own values. I had proven, first to myself and then quietly to my family, that strength does not require validation. It requires persistence, patience, and a willingness to act while others underestimate you. By the time my parents attempted another casual comment or subtle comparison, I met it with the calm assurance of someone who had already won. No words were needed. Their surprise and the faint acknowledgement of my accomplishments spoke louder than any argument could. I had become untouchable, not through confrontation, but through deliberate, unwavering action. And so, the journey that had begun with a tense dinner and a humiliating statement culminated in quiet triumph. I had claimed my life, my independence, and my peace. I had learned that true power does not come from anger or defiance, but from the steady, patient cultivation of strength. My silence had become my strength, my independence my victory, and my life a testament to the fact that no one, not even those who sought to belittle me, could ever take it away. From that day forward, I carried myself with unwavering confidence, knowing that the life I had built was mine entirely. The lessons I had learned, the power of patience, the value of deliberate action, and the unshakable strength of self-reliance would remain with me forever. And in the quiet satisfaction of independence, I finally understood what it meant to be truly free.